Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda. This episode, we're going to take a look at Wikipedia. And why I don't like Wikipedia, especially when it comes to deuterocanonical research. I don't know. Whenever it comes to the so-called Apocrypha, uh, that Protestants and Jews and academia calls it, or the Deuterocanon, which is Catholic and Orthodox refer to it, whenever it comes to that topic, it's funny how on popular sources, it's almost always gets facts wrong. And Wikipedia, in my personal experience with Wikipedia, is that it's not very good. It often misunderstands sources, misinterprets sources, and usually in a way that kind of fits with the author's worldview, which when it comes to the canon is almost always a dismissal of the Deuterocanon. You always have problems. And so I was doing some research on Martin Luther, his use of the Deuterocanon, the Second Leipzig Disputation. And guess what, folks? I went to Wikipedia against my better instincts and found this. So that's what we're going to look at. And I thought it was interesting enough to bring to your attention and also show you how you know, when people approach the issue of the Old Testament canon, they just assume that the Deuterocanon's Apocrypha and that it has no place in the Bible, and that skews the evidence. So that's what we're going to look at today on the Apocrypha Apocalypse. So fasten your seatbelts, folks, because the Apocrypha Apocalypse begins right now. Okay. Now, the text in question here is right here. It says, quote, they were not listed in the table of contents of his, that's Luther's, 1532 Old Testament. And if 1534 Bible, they were given the well-known title, Apocrypha. These books are not to be held equal to the scriptures, but they're useful and good to read. Now, that is problematic because as I'm doing my research, I never heard of the so-called Apocrypha not being in the table of contents of the first edition of Luther's German Bible. I was always under the understanding that they were included in both editions. In fact, all editions, I believe. But according to Wikipedia, they were not listed in the table of contents in the 1532 Old Testament. Okay, so that's a problem because I've never heard of that. In fact, if Luther had deliberately omitted the so-called Apocrypha in the first edition, that has lots of very important implications in terms of his view of these books. And it was always my impression that the Deuterocanon, or the so-called Apocrypha, were indeed part of the table of contents in Luther's Bible, all editions, as far as I know, certainly the first couple of editions. But according to Wikipedia, they were not listed in the table of contents in the 32 edition, but rather they were listed in the later edition. So I needed to check this out. And as you know, here at the Apocrypha Apocalypse, we try to go ad fontes, we go to the sources. First thing I wanted to see was actually look with the text with my eyes, or at least a photo reproduction or facsimile or a picture or something of Luther's German Bible to see whether or not these books are there. Now, searching the internet, it's funny, but at least I couldn't find a PDF or something of Luther's original edition of the German Bible, which, by the way, was put out in pieces. So the first edition would be the Pentateuch that came out. So I needed to see the table of contents of that. For some reason or another, I couldn't find it. I could find the title page but I couldn't find the table of contents. So did some more searching, and I found an article that was in a journal. In fact, the journal's name is the Andrews University Seminary Studies, Spring 1989. And it's written by a fellow named Strand, in which he gives the very, very detailed description of the very first edition of Luther's German Pentateuch. And in it, he also gives a description of the table of contents. So I was unable to locate the pictures of it, the Bible as a whole, but this article seems to me to be pretty authoritative. So here's what Strand writes.
Description of the first edition of Luther's German Pentateuch, general contents of Luther's Pentateuch. Quote, the contents of this first volume of Luther's OT translation are as follows. The title page is on the recto of the first leaf, see Plate 1, followed immediately by a table of contents on the verso of the leaf, see Plate 2. This listing of contents contains all of the OT canonical books plus the so-called OT Apocrypha. The fact that the apocryphal books are unnumbered sets them apart as distinct from the OT canonical writings. Kenneth A. Strand. Luther's first edition of the Pentateuch, Andrews University Seminary Studies, Spring 1989, Volume 27, Number 1, page 47.
So what does Strand describe? So he does actually have access to the first edition for this article. First, he says that the contents of the first volume of Luther's Old Testament translation has the title page on the recto and also the table of contents on the verso of the same leaf. And he provides 2 photographic plates of both. So thank God for that. So we can actually visually identify what the table of contents look like. He continues, he says, this listing of contents contains all of the Old Testament canonical books. And of course, he's Protestant, so that would be the proto-canonical books, plus the so-called OT Apocrypha. Oh, well, that's interesting because that's exactly what Wikipedia says doesn't exist. It was omitted, right? It said they were not listed in the table of contents. And he continues and says, the fact that the apocryphal books are unnumbered sets them apart as distinct from the OT canonical writings. So here I'm going to give you the second plate as reproduced in this article. Again, the article is by Kenneth A. Strand. It's titled Luther's First Edition of the Pentateuch. It's published by Andrews University Seminary Studies, Spring 1989, Volume 27, Number 1, page 47 is where you can find this plate. And it's available free on the internet. And check it out, folks. There it is. There are the Deuterocanonical books listed in the table of contents in Luther's first edition, 1523. So we have visual confirmation that these books are indeed there, but that doesn't explain how the author of the Wikipedia article, how did they get this wrong? Okay, well, obviously, they're not looking up primary sources. They're not visually verifying these things. They're relying on secondary sources. And warning, secondary sources, even good ones, sometimes can be wrong, and they can certainly be misunderstood. So I went back to Wikipedia, noticed footnote 22, cites Martin Breck's book, Martin Luther. It's translated, it's put out by Fortress Press. I actually was already familiar with Breck's work, and my general impression is it's not bad. He certainly did a lot of investigation. He's very well footnoted, and his conclusions, I think, are generally not bad. It's a good, solid source. So let's see what Breck actually says and compare it to what's reported on Wikipedia. Breck says,
Luther appears to have left the translation of the other books of the Apocrypha to Melanchthon and Jonas. He had grown weary of this work, and the Apocrypha did not have the same significance as the other books of the Bible. They were not even numbered in the table of contents in the 1523 Old Testament. In 1534, they were given the well-known title, Apocrypha. These books are not held equal to the Scriptures, but are useful and good to read. Martin Brecht, Martin Luther, translated by James L. Scharf. 3 volumes, Minneapolis, Fortress Press, 3. 98.
All right. So finally, the mystery solved. Why did Wikipedia get it wrong? It's because they didn't carefully read Brecht. They just assumed they knew what the answer was going to be, namely that Luther didn't accept these books. So they read Brecht thinking that he said they weren't listed in the table of contents, when that's not what Brecht actually says. As you can see, he says, quote, they were not even numbered in the table of contents in the 1523 Old Testament. In the 1534, they were given the well-known title Apocrypha. These books are not held equal to the Scriptures, but are useful and good to read. By the way, you can borrow this book on archive.org. So just type in Martin Brecht, Martin Luther. You can look up this page for yourself and see for yourself what Brecht says. Okay, so when it said, or when Brecht said they were not even numbered in the table of contents, the person who wrote the Wikipedia article assumed that meant they were omitted from the table of contents. Very different thing. And that's why precision is needed in this particular area of investigation. Old Testament canon, you got to be very careful about how you phrase things and qualify things. So Brecht says that they weren't numbered, but they were in the table of contents. They just weren't numbered. And then in 1523, they were given a separate title page, which is the famous Apocrypha, these books that are not held equal to Scripture, but are useful and good to read. Okay. This is exactly the same thing that we saw cited in Strand. Going back to the Strand quote, remember that last line, he says, the fact that the apocryphal books are unnumbered sets them apart as distinct from the Old Testament canonical writings. So both Brecht and Strand both recognize they're there in the table of contents. They're just not numbered, okay? And which is important, and it does tell you something about Luther, that he did not see them as canonical, but he did include them. So what did Wikipedia do for me? Well, it was interesting. I got to verify all this sources, secondary sources. I actually got to see it with my own eyes. The table of contents, first edition. Wasted a lot of time, but nevertheless, it was good fruit for a video. Just as a cautionary tale for you guys, when you're on the internet, especially on popular websites, especially when it comes to the Old Testament canon, Deuterocanon, beware, because if you read something that doesn't seem correct, it probably isn't. And indeed, this was not right. In fact, had the Wikipedia article been true, it wouldn't have fit at all with what I was seeing in Luther's primary sources. And it actually would have been a really big discrepancy in the flow of his development of thought. So anyway, I hope you liked the video. If you did, please give a thumbs up. Leave some comments, if you will. It helps the algorithm. Subscribe if you like this channel, and tell your friends too. Let's grow this channel together. Also, as I do every video, I put out a plug for William Albrecht and myself. We're both on Patreon. And we appreciate your financial support because it enables us to procure some very expensive sources so that we can produce videos like this and share it with the world. Otherwise, that information just is on bookshelves in the seminaries that only a few people will access. So until next time, Gary Machuda, have a great week, everyone. Bye-bye.